They weren't blockbusters. They weren't classy. They were raw, ugly, and dangerous films that slipped into theaters like contraband. The 1960s didn't just give us the golden age of Hollywood, it birthed a darker, grimier world where filmmakers pushed boundaries so far that cops raided cinemas, reels were seized, and audiences literally fainted in their seats. What happens when a movie is so wild that banning it only makes it bigger? Stay tuned because these stories are more outrageous than the films themselves. 1. Blood Feast, 1963. If you're talking about the true birth of gore in American cinema, you start here. Herschel Gordon Lewis was a marketing genius disguised as a filmmaker. On paper, Blood Feast is about an Egyptian caterer in Miami who butchers young women to resurrect an ancient goddess. In reality, it was one big excuse to splash blood, guts, and torn body parts across the screen like no one had dared before. The acting? Awful. The sets? Cheaper than a high school play. The blood? It looked like red paint straight from a hardware store. And yet, it worked. People lined up just to see if they could stomach it. Some theaters even hired nurses to stand by, pretending audiences might collapse. Police raided screenings, critics called it the worst film ever made, and Lewis proudly slapped those reviews on posters. That was his trick, lean into the disgust and sell the outrage. Blood Feast ended up grossing over $4 million, which was insane for a micro-budget splatter flick. Censors across the globe tried to bury it, the UK kept it banned for years, and moral crusaders warned it would rot minds. But all that noise only made it louder. Lewis had created a new monster, the splatter movie. And from then on, Grindhouse audiences couldn't get enough. 2. Love Camp 7, 1969. If Blood Feast birthed splatter, Love Camp 7 carved out a whole new genre of its own, the infamous camp films. Two American women go undercover in what's supposed to be a military prison camp. Instead of tense espionage, what audiences got was a barrage of cruelty, degradation, and shock value dressed up as war cinema. Directed by Lee Frost, this was ground zero for what later morphed into a whole wave of so-called camp movies. The controversy wasn't subtle. Feminist groups stormed screenings. In Chicago, activists poured red paint on the screen mid-showing, causing chaos and arrests. Censors in the UK refused to even classify it, leaving it completely outlawed. Canada and Australia said no as well. Even decades later, in the 2000s, the British board wouldn't touch it. Yet the movie spread underground, like wildfire. Without an official rating, it thrived in adult cinemas and backroom rentals, pulling in millions without mainstream advertising. Theaters got raided, prints confiscated, but new copies always surfaced. Rob Zombie once called it one of the most disturbing films ever made, and he meant that as a compliment. What made it so controversial wasn't just the content, but the fact it pretended to be historical, giving a sleazy edge of realism. That made critics furious. Lee Frost shrugged it off, bragging later that he had no regrets. He knew exactly what he was selling. Shock for shock's sake. 3. The Touch of Her Flesh, 1967. This one sounds like the fever dream of a pulp novel. A weapons dealer catches his wife cheating, storms out, gets hit by a car, and wakes up with two things: blindness and a burning rage against women. From there, it's a killing spree involving knives, blow darts, and even poisoned roses. Michael Findlay, directing under the alias Julian Marsh, cast his wife Roberta Findlay in the film. Together, they became the reigning duo of underground grindhouse in New York. Critics dismissed it as amateur filth, but that didn't matter. Theaters packed in curious viewers, censors in Boston and Detroit banned it. Canadian Customs called it dangerously psychotic and seized reels. In New Jersey, a theater owner was arrested for showing it, only to keep screening it defiantly out of spite. The film was cheap, rough, and proudly trashy. No official box office records survive, but it made enough money to spawn two sequels, The Curse of Her Flesh and The Kiss of Her Flesh, creating a trilogy of grindhouse infamy. Roberta later admitted bluntly, We made filth because filth paid the rent. And that's the essence of exploitation shock sells. It didn't matter how many critics trashed it or how many police raids followed. If a film got banned, that was free advertising, and the touch of her flesh turned censorship into a marketing strategy. The Naked Kiss, 1964. Samuel Fuller was no stranger to controversy, but this one pushed him beyond Hollywood's comfort zone. The Naked Kiss opens with an unforgettable scene, a woman violently attacking a man while wearing a wig that's ripped off to reveal her bald head. Right there, Fuller signaled, this wasn't going to be a typical drama. The film follows Kelly, a former prostitute trying to rebuild her life in a quiet town. She works with disabled children, falls for a wealthy local man, and for a moment it seems like redemption is within reach. Then she discovers his hidden secret, kills him with a telephone receiver, and the whole town turns against her. Studios wanted nothing to do with it. The Catholic Legion of Decency slapped it with condemnation, effectively banning it from mainstream theaters. In the UK, it stayed banned until 1990. Some U.S. theater owners were even warned they could lose their licenses if they dared to screen it. Critics at the time panned it as sleazy and unworthy. But decades later, directors like Martin Scorsese and Quentin Tarantino hailed Fuller as a punk rebel ahead of his time. Constance Towers, who starred in it, defended the film for years, insisting it was misunderstood. What made it dangerous in the 60s wasn't gore or shock, but its refusal to play nice with morality tales. Fuller flipped the script. Heroes weren't pure, villains weren't obvious, and redemption wasn't guaranteed. That blurred line was enough to scare censors into a ban. 6. Fuego, 1969. If you think American audiences were shocked, imagine what happened in Argentina when Fuego hit screens. Directed by Armando Bo and starring Isabel Sarli, the country's biggest movie star, it followed a wealthy woman whose uncontrollable desires turned her life upside down. Argentina at the time was under strict censorship, and the film's unapologetic tone made officials lose their minds. It was instantly banned across Argentina and later across much of Latin America. Enter Harry Novak, America's king of exploitation distribution. He picked up the rights, slapped on a scandalous marketing campaign, and sold it to Grindhouse theaters as an imported shocker. In the U.S., it played in sleazy cinemas where audiences couldn't believe what they were seeing. Some cities immediately shut it down, pulling reels and arresting theater managers. Despite that, Fuego became a cult hit in America. It was brazen, unapologetic, and unlike anything mainstream studios dared to release. The bans in Latin America destroyed Sarli's standing at home, but paradoxically turned her into a legend abroad. Years later, Argentina celebrated her as a national treasure, proving how far the pendulum swung from scandal to respect. The story of Fuego is proof of a simple Grindhouse truth. The harsher the censorship, the bigger the spotlight. Audiences didn't care about the bans, they showed up because of them. 7. Vixen, 1968. Russ Meyer was already known for pushing buttons, but Vixen turned him into a millionaire. The story centered on a free-spirited woman who seduces anyone in her path, friends, strangers, even family. For 1968 America, this was cultural dynamite. Banned in Dallas, Miami, and Boston, Vixen even triggered police arrests for theater owners who screened it. The controversy got so big that in 1969, the U.S. Senate held obscenity hearings and cited Vixen by name. Imagine that, an exploitation film debated in Washington. Instead of killing it, the attention turned Vixen into a box office phenomenon. It made over $8 million, an astronomical return for a film made on a shoestring budget. Meyer leaned into the scandal, proudly calling it the movie that made him rich enough to tell Hollywood to shove off. For all the outrage, the movie didn't fade into obscurity. It forced courts to reconsider obscenity laws and widened the gap between what people actually wanted to watch and what censors thought they should see. In hindsight, Vixen, Wasn't just trash, it was a legal landmark disguised as one. 8. The Curious Dr. Hump, 1969. Sometimes a movie is so bizarre it becomes unforgettable. The Curious Dr. Hump was a cheap Argentine import about a mad scientist who kidnaps couples in order to drain their energy for experiments on immortality. If that sounds ridiculous, wait until you see the monster, basically a guy in a rubber Bigfoot suit stomping around. Filmed in Buenos Aires, it was stitched together with local actors and friends of the filmmakers. American distributor Harry Novak saw dollar signs. He dubbed it into English, plastered shocking posters outside theaters, and sold it as a wild horror import. Censors were furious. In Argentina, it was banned outright. Canadian customs seized reels at the border. In the U.S., screenings got pulled again and again by local officials, but Novak knew the drill. Every seizure just gave it more underground credibility. The movie's actual production values were laughable, but the concept was so unhinged that audiences kept lining up. It became notorious not because it was good, but because it was too weird to ignore. Today, it's remembered less as cinema and more as a case study in how absurdity, censorship, and hype can collide to create a cult legend. 9. The Notorious Daughter of Fanny Hill, 1966. This one pretended to be high-class history, but delivered nothing but grindhouse sleaze. Marketed as a sequel to the famous 18th century novel Fanny Hill, the filmmakers hadn't even read the book. Instead, they cooked up a story about Fanny Hill's daughter arriving in London and stumbling through a whirlwind of corrupt aristocrats and seedy brothels. The trick worked at first. Box Office International pitched it as a glamorous period piece, and theater owners booked it expecting some steamy but safe costume drama. Once they realized what they had, the damage was done. Authorities raided theaters in Chicago, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles. Managers were arrested. Reels were confiscated. The UK censorship board flat out refused to even consider releasing it. Yet the movie managed to survive through underground screenings and drive-ins, where it quietly became a cult favorite. The irony? The fake, literary angle probably made it more dangerous. By dressing itself up as historical drama, it tricked its way into mainstream venues before being exposed. Censors hated that even more than usual, and the backlash was swift. But as history shows, backlash only fuels curiosity. The Notorious Daughter of Fanny Hill turned censorship into free advertising. 10. The Sexploiters, 1965. Few exploitation films walked the line between pulp crime and raw shock like The Sexploiters. Directed by Anton Holden and funded by a New York strip club owner, it begins as a detective story, a killer on the loose, targeting women. But within minutes, it swerves into unfiltered exploitation territory with strip sequences and underground club scenes. Unlike many in this list, the acting was surprisingly competent. The suspense scenes worked, the dialogue snapped, and the film actually felt like a legitimate noir at times. That almost made it worse in the eyes of censors. Ohio, Illinois, and Utah banned it entirely, labeling it gratuitous. Even its poster got banned in some cities for being too suggestive. Released on 42nd Street's Grindhouse circuit, it raked in around $600,000 in cash, huge for a movie made on a fraction of that. Police raided screenings, but Holden's film kept finding audiences. Holden never made another movie like it. He drifted back into sound editing, leaving this one offbeat gem behind. But the Sexploiters proved that you didn't need fake blood or monsters to push censors over the edge. Sometimes a sleazy noir with just the right mix of grit was enough to cause a full-scale crackdown. 11th. Scum of the Earth, 1963. If Blood Feast made gore a business, Scum of the Earth showed just how disturbing roughie films could get. Herschel Gordon Lewis, always chasing controversy, turned his camera away from buckets of blood and into a story about young women lured into modeling jobs that spiral into exploitation and blackmail. It was marketed as a cautionary tale, but let's be honest, its whole purpose was to shock and disturb. The film was raw. Instead of polished Hollywood glamour, it showed gritty black and white images of women manipulated and degraded. For conservative states, that was a direct provocation. Boston and other cities slapped immediate bans, while community groups campaigned against it, calling it corrosive to morality. What makes Scum of the Earth important is how it pioneered the roughie subgenre, movies that looked like moral lessons on the surface but were actually excuses for taboo thrills. These were the precursors to harder underground films that would explode later in the decade. Despite bans, the film earned strong box office returns in Grindhouse venues. Lewis himself shrugged at the outrage, claiming he was just giving audiences exactly what they paid for. In hindsight, the movie feels tame compared to what came later, but in 1963 it was considered corrosive enough to get theaters rated. 12th. She-Devils on Wheels, 1968. Imagine a biker gang, but swap the leather-clad men for a ruthless squad of women, and you've got she-devils on wheels. Once again, Herschel Gordon Lewis was behind the camera, proving he could find controversy in any subject. This wasn't your average biker flick. It gleefully inverted the formula, putting women in control as they tore across town, picking fights, humiliating men, and ruling the roads. Audiences were shocked. Critics branded it as dangerous for glorifying violence and flipping gender roles. The ban hammer came down hard in conservative areas. Police confiscated prints, and some towns outright refused to license screenings. But the chaos made the movie legendary. Drive-in theaters couldn't get enough of it. Viewers came for the motorcycles, but stayed for the sheer audacity. No one had ever seen women portrayed this way on screen, dominant, vengeful, and merciless. For Lewis, that was the whole point. While not as widely banned as his gore films, She-Devils on Wheels caused enough of a stir to be pulled from theaters in multiple states. It's now remembered as a wild, campy time capsule of Grindhouse culture, and one of the earliest cult biker films to give women the front seat in mayhem. 13. Something Weird, 1967. If you threw witchcraft, psychic powers, and LSD into a blender, the result would look like Something Weird. Herschel Gordon Lewis leaned into the decade's obsession with the occult and counterculture, producing a film so bizarre that even Grindhouse crowds weren't sure what to make of it. The plot follows a man disfigured in an accident who gains psychic powers. He teams up with a woman believed to be a witch to fight crime. Oh, and there's also a federal agent investigating drug use, with long sequences resembling hallucinations. The movie's surreal mix of mysticism and psychedelic visuals made censorship boards uneasy. At a time when America was in a panic about witchcraft and drug culture, Something Weird was seen as borderline dangerous. It was banned in multiple regions and seized in certain conservative states for promoting what officials called occult propaganda. Despite this, it developed a cult audience. Lewis marketed it as the strangest film you'll ever see, and audiences showed up to test whether that was true. In many ways, it was less about gore and more about atmosphere. Its hallucinatory vibe mirrored the counterculture's fears and fascinations. Today, it stands as a bizarre snapshot of a paranoid era when just hinting at witchcraft and drugs was enough to get a movie pulled. 14. Aroused, 1966. New York in the mid-60s was the capital of underground cinema, and Aroused was one of its rawest products. Shot on gritty city streets, it looked like a detective movie at first, following an investigator chasing down a killer targeting women. But like most exploitation of the time, it quickly shifted into darker territory, blurring crime thriller with sensationalism. Directed by Anton Holden, the film was made on a shoestring budget with financing from a strip club owner. Holden leaned into realism, shooting on location in dingy apartments and clubs. The effect was jarring. It felt less like fiction and more like a voyeuristic peek into the city's underbelly. Censorship boards pounced. Ohio, Illinois, and Utah banned screenings entirely. Even promotional posters were pulled from some towns for being too suggestive. Despite the backlash, the film earned over $500,000, a huge return for such a small production. Holden never returned to the genre, but Aroused left a mark. It was one of those films that tested the line between thriller and exploitation, showing how thin the boundary could be. What made it dangerous wasn't gore. It was the grim realism, the sense that audiences were being dragged into a world too raw for mainstream cinema. 15. A Smell of Honey, A Swallow of Brine, 1966. This one might have had the most absurd title of the decade, but don't let that fool you. It was pure exploitation dressed up as a morality tale. Directed by Byron Mabe and produced by the ever-controversial David F. Friedman, it claimed to be a lesson film warning young women against temptation. Of course, audiences knew better. The story followed a manipulative young woman who toyed with every man around her. The film was filled with lectures about morality, but every scene was crafted to shock. That hypocrisy drove censors mad. In city after city, officials banned it for obscenity. Critics mocked its laughable attempt to pass as educational. Yet, like so many others on this list, the bans only fueled curiosity. Drive-ins booked it anyway, and underground distributors kept it alive. The title alone was enough to intrigue passers-by, and Friedman leaned into the controversy, marketing it as too hot for traditional theaters. In the end, it made solid money, though not at the level of Russ Meyer or Lewis films. What it did prove was that even a thinly disguised morality play could be condemned if it dared to cross the line. A Smell of Honey, A Swallow of Brine became another case study in how bans and outrage served as the best advertising an exploitation filmmaker could ask for. So there you have it, 15 brutal exploitation movies from the 1960s that were too wild for censors, too raw for mainstream Hollywood, and too outrageous to ever be forgotten. They weren't polished, they weren't respectable, but they redefined what could play on a screen by breaking rules and cashing in on chaos. Which of these banned films fascinates you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe for more dives into cinema's wildest hidden history.